Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by BetDSI. Hey, you looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? BetDSI is the industry leader in football betting and the perfect sportsbook for both novice and professional bettors alike. New members get a 100% bonus match when you use the promo code SEATS100. Yeah, that's SEATS100 at betdsi.com. That's more than double your money to help start winning today. Once again, betdsi.com, promo code SEATS100, and get your limited time 100% bonus offer when you deposit today. Now, here's our show.
There is probably no single area holding so much of charm and beauty and the good things of life as Southern California. From the beautifully designed Spanish-type station at Los Angeles, in the heart of the City of the Angels, the thrill of Southern California is in the air. In the years since the turn of the century, Los Angeles has grown from a sleepy pueblo to a vast, seething metropolitan city. Fine buildings, huge stores, busy citizens. A city which has grown faster than any other in America in the past decade, and which sees a constant day-to-day influx of people from every part of the world. Of course, no look at Southern California would be complete without a round of Hollywood. This is Hollywood Boulevard and the world-renowned Grauman's Chinese Theater. In the forecourt of this celebrated cinema house are the footprints of the outstanding stars of the screen. Here, the idols of millions have left mementos of their undying fame. Radio and television, too, are focal points of Hollywood life, and the great broadcasting systems are important additions to the entertainment business, which contributes to the lifeblood of this community. At Sunset and Vine stands the western headquarters of the National Broadcasting Company, source of many favorite programs. Just down Sunset Boulevard is the Columbia Broadcasting System, outlet for thousands of hours of radio pleasure and television spectacles. This great network, along with NBC, ABC, and Mutual, draws thousands of enthusiastic radio and TV fans who come to see the stars and programs. Baseball occupies a prominent spot in the entertainment sports picture of Southern California. Both Hollywood and Los Angeles have teams that draw an ample quota of loyal rooters.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right there, friends. How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and it's a Good Seats Still Available. How is it going? We appreciate you finding us and downloading us, putting us in your earbuds. And of course, Good Seats Still Available is the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We appreciate it to no end. You're going out of your way to find us this week and listen in as we get into some fun times back in the 1950s when Los Angeles was this on the rise metropolitan area where everything was possible, and ribbons of highways and all kinds of great culture and weather and all that kind of stuff. None of the ills that sort of comprise a lot of the current Southern California experience with so much population and all that kind of stuff. But back in the 50s, it was a kinder, gentler time, and baseball very prominent in this metropolis, this budding metropolis known as Los Angeles and environs. And we talked about one of those baseball teams in the Pacific Coast League, that being essentially pretty damn close to major league quality on any given day or year. And Lord knows the Pacific Coast League tried on a couple of different occasions to kind of elevate themselves, either by willing themselves or at least trying to be confused with the two major leagues. And it's debatable, but as to whether the talent and the play was at that caliber. But I think you'd find more than a few people, and not just nostalgists either, who would have said that the caliber of play was pretty high and arguably equal to that, at least, of the major leagues. And Los Angeles had two of those Pacific Coast League teams for a large part of the Pacific Coast League's early and, actually just curtailed recently. Existence just ended really last year with the realignment of minor leagues and Major League Baseball. We talked about the first one back in our episode number 208 with our pal Dan Taylor, those being the Hollywood Stars. Yeah, Gilmore Field. And I guess we're sort of now near where CBS Television City and the Farmers Market area is and stuff. That's sort of where Gilmore Field was located. And to its name had a bevy of Hollywood stars as part of their ownership. But the other team we're going to get into today with our guest this week, Galen White, we're going to talk about the Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League. Yeah, the LA Angels was a team that played in the Pacific Coast League for a whole bunch of its existence, I think the team itself existed as early as 1892. But when the Pacific Coast League began in earnest in 1903, there were the Los Angeles Angels, and they lasted for, a good almost 50 some odd years. And it's a fascinating tale. And again, Los Angeles, in some respects, the populace didn't really sort of know any better, right? This was the now third largest metropolitan area in the 1950s as we focus our lens on the LA Angels history. Our discussion is actually going to be more focused on a period of time in the 50s with the Angels, and in particular highlighted by the 1956 last for them championship of the Angels in that league. And what a time it was. The book is called The Bilko Athletic Club, the story of the 1956 Los Angeles Angels. And the sort of key person in that story by his name is a guy named Steve Bilko. Now, Bilko, that sounds like an interesting name. Where have I heard that one before? Oh, maybe that sounds like Sergeant Bilko from the old Phil Silvers show. Really dating myself. But yes, make no mistake, there is no mistake. The name Bilko for that show was indeed, if you will, stolen or borrowed heavily, shall we say, by Nat Hiken, who created the Phil Silvers show and frankly brought Phil Silvers to certainly a higher level of fame than he ever had before, because he was a fan, Hiken was, of this Steve Bilko character who for 3 years in between major league stops, played and was revered as the star player, the star attention grabber for the Los Angeles Angels. I mean, knocking it out of the park, literally and figuratively, with home runs and all kinds of other batting records. And he was, by all accounts, in that period of time, about as big a star as you were going to find locally in the Los Angeles area. Steve Bilko was essentially like the Babe Ruth, if you will, of the Los Angeles baseball scene. And again, there was no Major League Baseball at this time. The Dodgers hadn't moved here yet. The Giants hadn't moved here yet, 1957. This was, or 58 for the first season. This 1956, you have to understand, this was essentially not only the peak of the LA Angels experience in the PCL, but this was essentially really a proving ground, this PCL, this Angels team, the Hollywood Stars too, that Los Angeles was more than ready for top-tier baseball. And through a whole bunch of different sort of intriguing situations and dramatic turns, the Angels became essentially kind of a pawn in the Dodgers actually coming to Los Angeles. It was the ownership of the Angels, the various intrigue behind how the Dodgers wound up coming to Los Angeles. Hey, Steve Bilko even was part of some of that effort. Chavez Ravine and its location and its frankly being given away in many respects to the Dodgers organization. All of that is encompassed in this fascinating story. So we talk about all this stuff about the Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League. The 1956 version is largely the central part of this conversation. And Steve Bilko is largely the face around it. But make no mistake, there's a lot of other stuff here. There's the formation of the Los Angeles Angels, part of how Brooklyn wound up coming to Los Angeles, why and how Dodger Stadium got to where it became located, what happened to Steve Bilko both before his turns as the star player of the Angels as well as afterwards. And interestingly, at the very end of his career in 1961, guess what? He actually became one of the first players to be brought into the Los Angeles Angels expansion franchise in 1961 of Major League Baseball. Yes, that's Orange County, ultimately getting their franchise, but it was a second LA Major League Baseball team. And Steve Bilko got to play his last 2 seasons of professional ball for the team and the name that he starred with in the late 1950s in the PCL version of the Los Angeles Angels. Keep up with me, friends. This is a fascinating conversation about a more wonderful and joyful and optimistic, I guess, less cynical time in baseball history. It's the Pacific Coast League, the Los Angeles Angels, and the 1956 version in particular, with our guest this week, Galen White, and it's a treat. You'll enjoy the conversation, and it's coming up in just a moment's time. We, of course, want to thank one of our great sponsors, and we're going to go back to the well again with our friends at Royal Retros. That's royalretros.com. And Dustin Alameda and his pals there put all kinds of great blood, sweat, and tears into their offerings. And this week is no exception. How about a wonderful throwback jersey, custom made. It ships in about 4 to 6 weeks. You can get your name on it and stuff, but literally painstakingly crafted and derived from all the great photography to the point of being about as accurate as you're going to find. A Los Angeles Angels throwback jersey from 1942. It's wonderfully made. It's got the little LA logo there. It's got a really cool health logo. It looks like it was some kind of a sort of a sponsorship of some sort. It's got Los Angeles across the front. If you want the away version in gray, there are 2 different versions to choose from. And it's one of just the many, many throwback jerseys and customizable at that you can find, along with t-shirts and other great stuff at Royal Retros, royalretros.com. They call themselves the King of Throwbacks. And of course, you'll see why by going to the site. And of course, once you find what you're going to put down your hot little cash or PayPal or Venmo for, I don't think they take Bitcoin yet, but whatever you choose and whatever you choose to buy, make sure that you enter this promo code at checkout. It's SEATS, SEATS, SEATS. That's the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases at royalretros.com. And again, the Los Angeles Angels throwback jersey from 1942. It's smart looking and just one of a bevy of great items for you to choose from at our pals. And thank you for their sponsorship, of course, at royalretros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did, as they say. All right, as we say, let's get into it, shall we? Here's our great conversation with Galen White. Wonderful topic, wonderful conversation and discussion. And I learned a lot about the baseball scene in the 1950s. I almost wish I had sort of been around to experience it, but why reminisce about something that's not possible when you can talk to the person who was actually there in the flesh and can kind of give us a clear-eyed view of it? Here's our conversation with Galen White we had just a couple of days ago. Please, as always, enjoy. I wanted to get maybe a little bit of a background before we get into this fun story about the LA Angels of the Pacific Coast League back in the day in '56. You started actually as a sports writer in earnest before kind of going off in a different direction career-wise. And do I kind of have this right that you kind of have, if you will, boomeranged back into sports writing, albeit in a different form?
Well, I had unfinished business, you might say, Tim. I started out as a sports writer. You're correct. I left California to go to the University of Oklahoma so I could be part of a great football program there. Bud Wilkinson was in his last year as coaching when I was a freshman. I went back out to California to go to junior college because my girlfriend at the time was dating someone else, and I didn't want her to. So eventually we got married. I returned to Oklahoma and went into sports writing. and found out I needed a little bit more money to raise the family that I had. So I went into the corporate world. But when I did that, I had already started some things that I wanted to complete. The research on the Bilko book, see, Bilko died in 1976. So 78. I interviewed him in 76, November, and went to Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. So I'm glad I started it then. That was the beginning. Two of my books, Bilko Athletic Club and Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, were started in the 70s. So for many years, I had these two books hanging out there. They were kind of gorillas on my back. And finally, I finished them after I retired from the corporate world. And along with those two, I've done 3 other books.
So I think that's great because you've essentially, you kind of started in earnest in what you thought was a passion or a calling, realized sort of the realities of life, and having been a fledgling journalist in my early years as well, and then kind of fleeing to the semi-safer world of corporate advertising and then by extension media technology and investments and that kind of stuff. But this podcast in an odd way is sort of a way for me, although I'm not retired per se from the day job. It's at least it allows me to proverbially scratch that itch in an audio form with a topic and a zone of interest for whatever reasons around teams and leagues and stuff, because nobody else is writing about them or talking about them.
Well, there are more options today to do what you're doing. When I was younger, you didn't have all these opportunities to branch out. Now, as a college student, I wanted to be both a sports writer and a sportscaster. But at that time, you didn't have very many guys doing both. It's only been in more recent years that some of the sports writers got into sportscasting. You went one way or the other at that time. I wound up going into sports writing because I just liked the printed word better, and I felt I had a greater talent in that area. And I also didn't feel that I had realized all my potential as a writer when I went into the corporate world. In fact, when I went into the corporate world, I was working for Hallmark. I was bored. So I would go out to Royal Stadium, which was new at that time. I did some work for the Royals. I also used that opportunity to do a lot of the interviews for the book, because the players like Billy Martin, well, he was a manager at the time, but a lot of the people I wanted to interview would come through Kansas City. Joe Garagiola, for example, who I interviewed extensively about Steve Bilko. So I used that time out at Royal Stadium to gather a lot of the material. And then when I started to travel a lot more in the corporate world, because I left Hallmark to go to Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, I would use my trips when I was in the area of somebody I wanted to talk to interview those players. So on the one hand, it was a blessing. On the other hand, it really did slow up the completion of the books.
Yeah, but you see kids out there as you're listening, right? That's the great way to kind of get the sort of the side hustle paid for by the man, if you will, and without sort of leaking out, right? I guess the only other, sports-related kind of realm of that would be maybe the refereeing thing, right? Which tends to be, you have to kind of that has to be more of an officially, sanctioned kind of thing, so that, both corporate environments kind of, can handle each other with schedules and that kind of stuff. But no, I mean, you're describing, frankly, a way to kind of keep the passion, the side project, the whatever, in the background, and, kind of work to live, so to speak, but then also live to work somehow, right?
Well, in the corporate world, of course, I had to keep some of these things under the radar. There were some people I could be a little bit more open with. I remember the vice president of public relations at Goodyear, who was a big sports fan, and he knew I was working on a book when they hired me. And to him, that was, I think, one of the reasons he hired me, because he liked the stories that I was telling him about what I was working on, and I think he wanted to provide a vehicle for me to finish what I had started. So it for some people it was helpful. Others, you just didn't want them to know a whole lot about what you were doing. But growing up in Los Angeles, back to the beginning, I went to games at Wrigley Field, and that is where most people will identify with Home Run Derby. The original Home Run Derbies were at Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. A lot of your television movies, Ronald Reagan was in the one where he plays Grover Cleveland Alexander. that was filmed at Wrigley Field. So a lot of your movies were filmed at Wrigley Field. That's where I went to games as a kid with my father and my brother. And I really fell in love with the ballpark and became a Cubs fan because the Angels at that time were a Cubs farm team.
Yeah, and that was going to be sort of the idea of doing this book sort of get started. Well, we had a conversation a number of months ago with Dan Taylor about the Hollywood stars, and the thing that kind of struck me in that conversation, and maybe this is sort of the grist, sort of the on-ramp to this conversation, is we'll get to the rivalry and all that stuff in Los Angeles in a second, but I almost got the feeling doing the research that the Angels were the more, if you will, Hollywood of the teams versus, say, the interestingly named Hollywood stars in terms of how many stars and filmings and those kinds of things. When you mentioned Home Run Derby, I get the feeling that Wrigley Field in L.A. was more, I guess, connoted or overlapping maybe with the entertainment industry, or do I have that wrong, or is it maybe it was more fondly or deeply remembered perhaps than the stars?
Well, Gilmore Field was located in Hollywood, and it was also owned by a group of movie stars. So it was more Hollywood, you might say. It was more glamorous. More of the actors and actresses went to games there in Hollywood. The Wrigley Field, of course, as compared with Gilmore Field, was the bigger star as a ballpark. But the fans of the Angels were more blue-collar types. Groucho Marx, however, went to games at Wrigley Field, and there were a few others. I believe Nat King Cole also went to games at Wrigley Field. But your basic clientele was quite different between the stars. It was more the glamour, the Hollywood type, the entertainers. And over at Wrigley Field, you had people like my father, who was a minister. I remember one time going to a game. Actually, we were going to a game at Wrigley Field, at Gilmore Field. And my father, an Angels fan, and his friend, also a minister, was a Hollywood Stars fan. And they started needling each other. And my dad said to him, he said, "Gene, how can you be a Christian and pull against the Angels?" So there was this rivalry. Now, he was kidding, of course, but there was this rivalry. And I went to games at Wrigley Field. I mean, it was a beautiful ballpark. You were close to the action. You were closer to the action at Gilmore Field. In fact, you were right on top of it there. It was a smaller ballpark. But Wrigley Field was built in 1925. It was really the original Wrigley Field because the Cubs called their park, which was built earlier, they called it Cubs Park until 1926 when they renamed it Wrigley. So if you're ever in a trivia contest, want to know the original Wrigley Field, it was not Chicago, it was in Los Angeles.
Well, don't get me started on the Chicago chai feds and the original reason and behind the whales and the actual origination.
Right.
Now I married into just not only Cub fans, but just the whole, all that comes with it. So it's a very it's now seeped into my blood, even though I grew up in the New York area. But so describe this, and we'll get into the '56 season specifically in a minute. But this was a real, out and out rivalry between these two teams, right, in the LA area. And I'm guessing that you couldn't really kind of be a fan of both. You kind of had to really kind of choose one or the other, just like any other dual team rivalry in the United States.
Red Sox, Yankees.
Yeah. Just
think of it that way. In fact, Irv Katz, who was a PR man for the Angels, the Stars, went on to do some work for the Dodgers. He compared it with the Red Sox and the Yankees, and it was just like that. There were brawls. In fact, one of the biggest fights was in Life magazine, which was a big magazine at that time, and it commanded like 6 pages of photographs. And there was some real slugging going on during that fight. In fact, they called the police out to the ballpark, and the players, only the players who were in the game could be in the dugout. The rest had to stay in the clubhouse. It gives you an idea of what that particular fight was like. But they were fighting all the time. Now, were some of them staged? Some of the players are interviews. George Freese, who played both for the Stars and the Angels, believed some of them were staged. Or at least, there was something done to try to create the friction that would lead to a fight. But the fans got into it, let me tell you that. And the Stars-Angels games, My father was not one to get too worked up about anything, but he got worked up over the Stars Angels games, as well as my brother and I.
Yeah, I'm guessing it was also aided and abetted by the fact that Los Angeles it wasn't the second largest metropolitan area like it is today, but it was certainly on the hugely upward trajectory, right? Because of the film industry and the entertainment industry and just growing all kinds of different industries and stuff. And media, right, was pretty pronounced there. And I'm guessing perhaps unlike, any other quote unquote minor league, we'll get into that in a minute. You had, top tier television stations and radio stations covering this thing like it was an American League or a National League kind of setup.
Well, the two announcers were quite well known. Mark Scott was the announcer on Home Run Derby. He was the Stars play-by-play announcer. Bob Kelly, who best known as the voice of the LA Rams, and his voice and faces appears in a lot of movies that related to football. So Kelly was the play-by-play announcer for the Angels. Neither liked each other. Their animosity towards each other was real. That translated into the airways, and it riled up the fans. Then you had players on the Stars side like Carlos Bernier. He was from Puerto Rico, had a hot temper. Bobby Bragan was a manager there, and the Stars had more players kicked out in one of the seasons. I think it was 1953 it was, because that's when Bernier and Bobby Bragan were together for the first time. Probably during the course of that year, they probably got kicked out a combined 50 times. It was amazing. They were getting kicked out all the time. There were fights all the time. And Mark Scott, his sign-off on his broadcast was, and remember, sports fans, whether you win or lose, always be a good sport. Well, that little sign-off slogan would rile my brother and I up, and I thought, how could this bunch talk about being a good sport when they're fighting all the time?
Yeah, that's something. So, but I guess then growing up in LA, this was essentially as close as a thing to a top tier sports rivalry, right? I mean, I'm sure you followed baseball, in the Eastern hinterlands, right? But this is before the time, not until the late 50s, right? Till the two New York teams obviously boldly moved to California. I mean, this was the Pacific Coast League was. I wouldn't even call it borderline professional, because I think even Pants Rowland, who was running the league at the time, had eyes towards taking this kind of competition and the solid talent that was all up and down the West Coast, the Pacific Coast League, and almost maybe even going into the major leagues somehow, some way.
Well, most of the players in the league, in the Pacific Coast League, had played in the majors. There were some of the younger players. Bill Mazeroski, Hall of Famer with the Pirates. He came up through Hollywood. He was an 18-year-old playing for the Hollywood Stars. Mudcat Grant, who went on to have a great career in the majors, he came through with San Diego Padres. And if you go back further, Joe DiMaggio and Dom came out of the San Francisco Seals. Ted Williams came out of the San Diego Padres, as did Bobby Doerr, both Hall of Famers. So the league produced a lot of great players over the years. Somehow or another, after the World War II, it still had a lot of major leaguers in there, but they were more past their prime. And they preferred playing on the West Coast. They made more money. They traveled by plane. And the climates were much more conducive to a player who wanted to play longer, because you didn't have the humidity and the heat of the East. You traveled by plane rather than by train. So the players liked playing on the West Coast. And then for much of the period after World War II, leading up to the Dodgers and Giants coming to LA in 58, you had the teams would go into a town. Let's say the San Francisco Seals would come into LA. They play Hollywood for 7 days, and then they play LA for 7 days, the Angels. So they'd stay in the same town, even though they were traveling for 14 days. You can get a lot of trouble doing that.
Okay, so explain to me then the state of the league in the 1950s. You'll see. We're getting into the season specifically. We'll get there.
Yeah.
But it feels to me that, and I'm an armchair historian at best, right? So you know this subject far better than I, and hence the sort of curiosity factor of this little show. But explain to me, in the 50s, it feels to me like the Pacific Coast League was either overtly or covertly or somewhere in between, flirting with or pursuing or not afraid to be confused with the quote unquote two major leagues in terms of all of it, right? And I guess fueled perhaps in LA in particular with two white hot rival teams.
Well, so you had a combination of things. We as fans, we had, you might say, and I still do to some degree, although I'm getting over it, Tim, a chip on our shoulders about the Eastern sports writers and their arrogance. They were always putting down teams from the West Coast, including our football teams. I was a big UCLA Bruins football fan, and the rivalry with USC was a great rivalry. But nobody talked about it back east. It was all, as far as west as they went in terms of their interest and their coverage, was Notre Dame and South Bend. So we were left out of most of the conversations, both in football and baseball. So to us, the Pacific Coast League was our major league. We made no apologies for it. These players, we saw some great players come through the league. And of course, a lot of the teams played exhibition games out in L.A. I remember in 1955, the Cleveland Indians and the New York Giants playing a game at Wrigley Field. They packed Wrigley Field out. Capacity was only 25,000. But it was a replay of the World Series the year before between the Indians and the Giants. It was a great, and it was just, we saw our Major League Baseball in the spring when the teams would come out there, and a lot of them did spring training there and there in California or Arizona. And then, of course, during the regular season, we saw the Coast League. And to us, it was as good as what we saw. Now, the only Major League Baseball we saw through much of the 50s would be at the end of the season, would be the World Series, and there'd be the Dodgers against the Yankees every year, ho-hum. It was great baseball, but we didn't see much of it. What we saw mostly was in the ballparks of the West Coast.
But that's also, it's not like you didn't know any better, right? I mean, you saw national coverage or sort of read, right? Yeah. But indeed, it was sort of this sort of, I guess, East Coast or Midwest and or Midwestern provincial kind of approach, because it wasn't, quote unquote, the major leagues.
Oh, we knew about Willie Mays and Stan Musial and greatly appreciated it. In fact, my father, I remember traveling east one summer and took us to a game at Old Bush Stadium, and we saw Stan Musial play. I remember quite well. Harvey the Cat McKean was a pitcher for the Cardinals. I would have been 6 years old. That was 1952. Later years, of course, I went to Wrigley Field in Chicago, and that was great. But I felt, hey, I didn't even know the one in L.A. was the originally named L.A. before Chicago. But I felt, look, I enjoyed it more in L.A. than I did in Chicago, because when I went to the games in Chicago, it wasn't like today. There was a lot of empty seats, and there were kids running around taking the seats that were up and clapping them down, making a lot of noise. So I more enjoyed the games in L.A. than Chicago.
Yeah, and the park was probably a little bit more intimate, even more so than Wrigley here in Chicago in terms of its
absolutely, yeah, it was. Yeah. Well, like I say, if you watch the original Home Run Derby, and you get a pretty good feel. There were houses behind the left field wall, and Steve Bilko and another player who they had in 1955, and I write about in the Bilko Athletic Club, Buzz Clarkson. He'd been a great Negro Leagues player and also played in Puerto Rico, had a lot of power. He was close to 40 years old when he came to L.A. in 1955. He had hit 42 home runs the previous year in the Texas League. Buzz targeted this one house over the left field wall, and he once hit a hole through the door over there. There was a picture in the paper of kids looking at the hole. I mean, those were the kind of things that really enamored you with the ballpark and its players. They became king-size heroes to us. Not as well known to the rest of the country, of course. I mean, Willie Mays and those players, Mickey Mantle, were known all over the country. And our stars often were not. Although, Steve Bilko, who, again, I write about in the Bilko Athletic Club, he had some fine years with the St. Louis Cardinals. His rookie season, he had 21 home runs in 1953. So he'd been to the majors, and many of the players in the Coast League had been to the majors before they came out and played for the Angels or the Stars.
All right. right, what's this? Bet DSI. All right. Well, hey, you're looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? Well, Bet DSI is an industry leader, perhaps even the industry leader in football betting, and is the perfect sports book for both novice and professional bettors alike. At Bet DSI, you can also enjoy live in-game betting. So what's that mean? Well, it means you can not only bet your favorite teams, but you can do that and all kinds of different prop bets and various situations all game long on nearly every play to the final whistle. BetDSI's been around for 20 years and paying winners all along the way. 10,000 and more betting options daily on all the sports you love to watch. Daily fantasy, top ratings on all the betting review sites, you name it. BetDSI is the way to go. They've got a very user-friendly interface and mobile site and has the fastest payouts in the industry. Simply play, you win, and you get paid. Doesn't get better than that. Plus, BetDSI offers betting options for just about everything. NFL, college football, sure, but NBA, NHL, UFC, golf, other sports, politics even, reality TV, esports, virtually everything. Try live betting at BetDSI, and you can bet on every major sport and event through the entire game, every play, and every minute. So, new members, that's what you're here for, right? New members get a 100% bonus match to their deposit when you use the promo code SEATS100. Again, 100% a bonus match when you use promo code SEATS100. That's more than double your money to start winning today. So once again, go to betdsi.com and use the promo code SEATS100 and get this limited time 100% bonus offer and make some extra cash on the sports you know and love. And additionally, if you use Bitcoin, you'll get an additional 100% deposit bonus on your first 2 deposits up to $2,000. It all adds up to BetDSI being the place to do your betting as the football season approaches. It's only a game until you bet it at BetDSI. Thank you, BetDSI, for your sponsorship of this episode. And now, back to our conversation. All right, so set the tone here for the team circa 1956. I guess this is really another way of asking. Put the Angels into context for me in the 1950s. This is obviously a number of years and maybe still not before the rumblings and maybe the admission that 2 major league teams were going to come and colonize California. But put the Angels in perspective in the 50s, sort of paint a picture for me. And I think it's also helpful, too, through the eyes of your childhood, right? I will say that having done this show for, almost 5 years now, there is definitely a thread about teams and leagues and whatnot in young adults, certainly generally males, but not exclusively, in their childhood, their impressionable youth, when it comes to sports and the teams or leagues that come across their immediate radar as they're growing up. There's an attachment there, right? And it's it kind of is sort of gilded, I guess, into one's memory, and it's. I have a feeling this is sort of a similar situation with you.
It's Field of Dreams stuff, Tim. I have a friend, Bill Swank, who's a baseball historian for, in particular, the San Diego Padres. He once said to me, the greatest era of baseball, Galen, is when you're a kid. And that really is, because you're impressionable. These are your first heroes. You're not cynical. You see these guys just through the eyes of a kid. And so let's say a Steve Bilko, who was a massive man, 6'1", 235 pounds. That was probably at his lightest. He often played as heavy as 270 pounds. I mean, he looked like Babe Ruth to me when I saw him for the first time as a 9-year-old in 1955. Buzz Clarkson, who was on that same team, and I mentioned him earlier, he was a black man, played in the Negro Leagues. Tremendous power. He looked like old man Moses at third base, the way he moved, but he was a good fielder. And when he hit the ball, I thought he was Josh Gibson, although I didn't know much about Josh Gibson at that time. So these players that you would see, they were. It was like in the movies. They were much larger than life, not only because you're a kid, but because these guys were not well known outside of the areas where they played. So when they came to us, we then sort of adopted them as if they're your own. And I think that's one of the great things about minor league baseball, and one of the reasons that I've written so much about the minors, is that when the players pass through these small towns, these towns connect with those players, and then they associate with these players as they go on in their careers. They become part of that town. So when the Angels had, and I was even younger, Gene Baker, an outstanding shortstop, black shortstop, who joined the Angels in 1950. Now, I was just thinking about this the other day. I remember Baker playing. I was 6 years old, 6 and 7. He played with the Angels for 4 years. He wasn't called up until 53. And when he went up same time as Ernie Banks. And he was a better shortstop, by the way, than Ernie Banks. But he was older and more experienced, and he moved to second base. And so Ernie Banks and Gene Baker became the first all-black double-play combination. So Baker, I started to follow him with the Angels, where he became initially my favorite player with the Cubs. And then, of course, Ernie Banks took over, and he became Mr. Cub, and he became my favorite as well. But the players, it was like you discovered these players when you were a small kid. And then you followed them on through their career. And that's the way it was for some other guys who came from the Angels and went on up. I didn't remember seeing Frankie Baumholtz play with the Angels, but he went on to star for the Cubs. And because I knew he'd played for the Angels, well, I automatically followed him. One of my books I did with Ransom Jackson, and that book is called Accidental Big Leaguer. And he was a 2-time All-Star for the Cubs, then went on to play for the Dodgers, and he actually replaced Jackie Robinson when Jackie retired. I wrote a book again with Ransom Jackson, and I had first heard of Ransom because he played for the Angels. And I might not have even done the book, except that I was so fascinated with his history. He'd played college football at TCU in Texas, played in the same backfield as Bobby Lane, a great quarterback at Texas and in the NFL. So I write about Ransom, and I kind of get my fill of the Cubs in the early 50s. So yeah, it's been writing about all these books, but particularly the 56 Angels was, you might say, a love letter. In fact, I had somebody tell me that the book read like a love letter. That's fine. I hope it conveyed some of the passion that I felt at that time.
Well, let's talk about Bilko, because it sounds like he's not only the star, but also indicative of the types of players that were sprinkled around this Angels team, and maybe even by extension some of the other PCL clubs too, because this is a guy, right, who got his start with the Cardinals, right, in the National League, 49 to 54, had a fairly significant cup of coffee with the Cubs, and then effectively got, if you will, sent down, right, to the LA Angels, which, interestingly, and maybe we'll get into this, but either rejuvenated his career or proved the National Leaguer types wrong about his abilities, or maybe a combination of the two. But I'm getting a sense that, kind of alluding to my observation earlier, right, this Pacific Coast League, right, was just as stocked with quote-unquote major leaguers as the major leagues themselves, whether they were going up or down, or frankly just not given a fair shake in the other, those other leagues.
Well, let's kind of break it down this way. Bilko broke in with the Cardinals at age 20. He was thrown into the middle of a pennant race in 1949. The Cardinals were nip and tuck with the Dodgers. The Dodgers wound up winning the pennant, but Bilko did quite well in the brief period of time he was played near the end of the season. They had some injuries, and Bilko was at first base, and he you might say, carried his weight. For the 1950 season, they played Bilko up as if he was going to be the next Lou Gehrig, the next Jimmy Fox. The publicity that Bilko got was tremendous. He came to spring training in the eyes of the Cardinals overweight. They also tried to make him a pole hitter. He was not a pole hitter. His power was to left center and right center. So they wound up and Joe Garagiola, I write about this in the book, they wind up putting him in a sweatsuit to lose this weight, and he lost a tremendous amount of weight in a short period of time. It was something you wouldn't see today. It was just ridiculous. But here was a guy, too, that could hit as Garagiola said, he could hit a ball over a fence with his elbow, and they were trying to make a pole hitter out of him. So the combination of making him a pole hitter, finding him if he was over a certain weight that they had specified for him, it played with the guy's head. And Bilko was a simple guy. He wanted to be loved. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to lose weight, as his managers wanted him to do. But it didn't help. He was a great beer drinker, too, by the way. But he just couldn't do it. So he wound up, after a few failures with the Cardinals, in 1953, he is batting cleanup for the Cardinals. He's there with Stan Musial, Reggie Haynes, having a great year. And he drove in 84 runs as a rookie, hit 21 home runs. His batting average was .251. He did lead the league in strikeouts, but if I gave you the number, 125, that's nothing compared to what these guys strike out today. So Bilko had a great rookie season. It so happened that the Cardinals did not have a black player. And on the West Coast, there was a first baseman named Tom Alston, who had hit quite a few home runs in San Diego, which was a ballpark very friendly to left-handers. The Cardinals made Tom Alston their first black player. Well, he was going head-to-head to Bilko, and the Cardinals decided to keep Alston and get rid of Bilko. That's how he wound up with the Cubs. Well, the Cubs had a pretty good first baseman named D. Fondy, a better fielder than Bilko, but not as good a hitter. Bilko didn't get a chance to play much at all. Although, Ransom Jackson saw him play enough to where I remember in talking with Ransom about Bilko, he said he hit the ball like the old cartoons where they have the baseball goes off screaming in the distance. And that's the way Bilko was. He was a great power hitter. Come the 55 season, the Cubs sent him to Los Angeles. Bilko did not want to go. He is from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. He did not want to play on the West Coast. He had previously played in the minors in Rochester, much closer to his home. So he didn't want to go to Los Angeles until the manager there at the time, Bill Sweeney, said to him, "I'm not going to bother you about your weight. I'm going to leave you alone. I don't want to know what you weigh." Well, that was music to Bilko's ears. Nobody was going to be nagging him about his weight. Well, he had a great season that first year. He hit 37 home runs. That was 1955. In 1956, he's like Babe Ruth. He wins the Triple Crown on the West Coast. He hits 55 home runs, leads the league in hitting, 164 runs batted in. So I'm 10 years old when Bilko has this Ruthian-type season in Los Angeles. So who do you think I think he is? Babe Ruth. and I wasn't the only one. You've heard of Bobby Grich, who was a fine ball player with the Baltimore Orioles and the California Angels. Grich is a couple years younger than I, and he wrote one of the blurbs for the book, and he said that to him, Steve Bilko was Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, and Ted Williams all rolled into one, and that's the way we felt.
In doing your research, what was his state of mind going from the Cubs, if you will, down to the minors in Los Angeles? This is I in doing some of my crack research, right? Bilko was at least the Cubs announcer in '54 was hoping he would be part of a double play combo that he could nickname Bingo to Bango to Bilko. It didn't sort of work out that way. There were a handful of games where that could have been the case, but I get the sense that he was kind of known and had some kind of cachet, and all of a sudden now he's being, if you will, sent down to the minors, albeit the Pacific Coast League, right? Unique in its own way, but it's clear that he responded quite well and became the vital cog and truly a star when he came to Los Angeles. But I have the feeling that he didn't sort of feel that way as he was getting ready to pack up and go.
No, at first he did not want to be there. Then and at first he struggled. But midway through the 55 season, he took off. The fans, he quickly became a favorite of the fans after hearing a few boos early on. But the fans fell in love with him. He became a folk hero. He was an original folk hero. Keep in mind, L.A. had not had, other than in football, had not really had any great stars. They'd had in the college ranks John Arnett. They'd had with the Rams, Bob Waterfield, Norm Van Brocklin, but no one in baseball because they hadn't had a major league team. So here comes Bilko, this big guy. He had been in the majors. He was an affable guy. Everybody loved Steve Bilko. And other people were like me. They'd go to the ballpark and see Bilko hit one of these monster home runs, and he looked like Babe Ruth. Well, guess what? He became our Babe Ruth. He was also kind of a guy that people could relate to. He watched Lawrence Welk on television. He preferred roller derby in terms of other things he watched. He liked his favorite song was White Sports Coat and a pink. Marty can't think Robbins song, a White Sports Coat and the Pink Carnation. He he was a beer drinker. He didn't like wine. The other thing that helped him out was in 1955 there was a television series that came out called You'll Never Get Rich, starring Phil Silvers. It became known as the Phil Silvers Show. Well, guess what? Character he plays, Sergeant Bilko. Why did they call it Sergeant Bilko? Well, it's because the producer and Neil Simon was one of the screenwriters. Bilko was their favorite player. So they picked Steve Bilko as Phil Silvers' name. Silvers is quoted as saying, I could have just as well been Corporal Hodges or Private First Class Musial. I gave it to a guy who needed it. So that was Steve Bilko. People could connect with him. It
sounds like there's a relatability there, and Nat Hiken.
Yeah.
And all that. Yeah, I can see where that can literally rub off, if you will, in terms of spinning off a character or making that relatable. He just seems like he's kind of a guy's guy, so to speak, and fans could sort of attach to that, even despite his play on the field.
Well, I'll give you an example. He'd go into a bar and somebody would buy him a beer. He'd buy him a beer back. And that was the kind of guy he was. And people couldn't believe how nice a guy he was. He wasn't arrogant at all. In fact, Jim Brosnan, who was his teammate in Los Angeles in 1955 and was a roommate of Steve Bilko, and Jim Brosnan did a couple books, one called The Long Season, the other one called Pennant Race. And actually, he was the first player to kind of take us inside the locker room. He did this long before Jim Bouton. But I remember Brosnan telling me, he said, psychologically, Bilko had doubts about himself that were never resolved in major league competition. This was partly because he had such great success in the minor leagues. He was a genuine hero, an extraordinary performer. He couldn't really sustain that in the big leagues because he didn't have that kind of talent. He didn't have the arrogance either. All really good ball players have a good deal of arrogance about them. He didn't have. He was never an egotistical fellow, which is a necessity for success in professional sports. And I always thought that was an interesting quote. Now, was Henry Aaron arrogant? No, but he had supreme confidence in his ability. There's a lot of other guys you could look around and say they are arrogant. Aaron, I'll say right out of the batter's box, was not an arrogant person. But I think it does require a certain arrogance, a certain level of confidence that you're better than everybody else. If you're a pitcher, you're going to get whoever's at the plate out. If you're a hitter, you're going to hit out of the ballpark whatever it is that pitcher pitches. Bilko, at least at the big league level, did not have that.
Interesting. Just curious, any anecdotes about Bilko and Phil Silvers? Did they ever meet?
Oh yeah.
See each other in the studio or the ballpark or either of those? Publicity.
When they rolled out the Phil Silver, You'll Never Get Rich, of course, in their PR, they invited Bilko to be there. He had to be talked into going by his teammate George Freese. The series actually was introduced in 56. I might have said 55. Bilko did not want to go to the press reception in Hollywood. George Freese loaned him, got him a suit, took him there. Bilko agreed only to go to it if Freese went with him. There were publicity pictures taken. There's a picture of Phil Silvers with both Freese and Bilko in the book. And also at one point, Phil Silvers wanted to take Bilko to Las Vegas for a nightclub act. Bilko did not go. He was a shy man. he did not like the limelight. Again, if he wasn't at the ballpark hitting home runs, he preferred to be home with his kids and probably sipping on a brew.
But he was a local celebrity, though, right? In Los Angeles, right? Again, reminder, L.A., right? Major booming metropolis going on right now. And in essence, unbeknownst to the East and Midwestern types, right? He's in the cradle of entertainment, right? In Los Angeles, and being a quote unquote local celebrity in Los Angeles, right, is a pretty big outsized deal versus maybe even some of the smaller markets in the National and American leagues.
His manager in '56, Bob Sheffing, had this quote: "More people in L.A. today know Bilko than Marilyn Monroe." That gives you some idea as to a celebrity. There was a sports columnist named Ned Cronin of the L.A. Times. He once wrote, remember 1956 was an election year. Eisenhower was running against Adlai Stevenson. And so Cronin suggested that there be a ticket of Mano and Bilko. Mano was for president and Bilko for vice president. And he wrote, a vote against Bilko, a vote against Mano and Bilko is a vote against home, mother, and bottled beer. Mickey is a cinch to get the ballot of every man and woman who can tell the difference between a three-base hit and a crock of kumquats. Bilko, of course, is a cinch to sweep California. And since the vice presidential candidacy seems to be a matter of grave concern, Richard Nixon was the vice president under President Eisenhower, and that's what he's referring to there. A campaign issue of stirring dimensions, it is comforting to have a nominee who's popular with one and all, except possibly the pitcher, Stout Steve, has threatened with decapitation while taking a turn at bat. So yes, he was extremely popular. Even Hollywood Stars fans. I remember talking with Wes Parker. I was out on the West Coast and visiting Dodger Stadium, and Wes Parker wanted to meet me and members of the Bilko family. We were there for Steve's induction to the Shrine of the Eternals, which is part of the baseball reliquary, a poor man's Cooperstown. And so the family, Steve, of course, long since had passed away, but this was 2015 after the book came out. And we're in L.A., and Wes Parker comes to the ballpark. He was an outstanding first baseman for the Dodgers, and he wanted to meet me, and he wanted to meet the family. He was a Hollywood Stars fan growing up, but he was also a Bilko fan because Bilko just cut across. It didn't matter who you rooted for. You liked Steve Bilko. He was the kind of guy you connected with. He hit these monstrous home runs. He was the hero of a lot of kids, whether or not they were Angels fans.
All right, I got a couple of questions about the composition of the team and Bilko in particular. You look at 56 and 57, sorry, it's 55 through 57, his 3 seasons in Los Angeles. A couple of things that stand out to me. So number one, and thank God for things like baseballreference.com with the don't forget the hyphen in between baseball and reference. His stats just stand out. Egregiously so versus the rest of the team. I mean, maybe Jim Bolger, on that 56 team, looked pretty sterling as well. But I mean, this is a guy who, led in so many different sort of batting categories, let alone I'm assuming he was less a fielder than he was sort of an offensive threat as a batter. But my immediate question is, with stats like this, especially his long balls, 55 home runs in a season in 56 and almost around the same output in the years prior and following, was he not getting another look at the National League to go back up for his second cup of coffee? Or was I'm just curious because maybe I'm looking at this through more modern lens, right? I'm surprised he stayed for 3 years in the PCL, given the kind of output he was putting out.
Well, here's what happened, Tim. In 56, he was having this great year. He was box office, okay? He was the box office, wherever they played. The Angels gave him a great contract, and he signed a waiver to where no big league team could draft him. He wanted to stay in the West Coast. Why? Well, his salary with the Angels was around $15,000. That was double what the major league minimum was at that time. So Bilko had been in the major leagues At that time, he would have been making half of that. In fact, when he returned to the major leagues in 1958, he took a pay cut. In addition, his endorsements, personal appearances, was another $15,000 to $20,000. Bilko was making between $30,000 and $35,000. That doesn't sound like a lot of money today. But keep in mind what Mickey Mantle, his salary was in 1956. Mickey Mantle's salary was $35,000. So Steve Bilko, between his endorsements and his salary, was doing as well as Mickey Mantle was just on his salary. Now, Mantle, of course, was picking up some endorsements on top of that. But that'd give you an idea. He signed a 2-year waivers so he could stay in L.A. Bilko's philosophy was, why did he want to go back to the big leagues at the major league minimum and sit on the bench as he was with the Cubs or with any other team? If he was going to go back to the majors, he wanted to start. He wanted to play every day where he felt he could do in the majors what he did in the minors. What's interesting now, the Cincinnati Reds drafted him. They didn't keep him. They sent him out to the Dodgers. The Dodgers had Gil Hodges and had Norm Larker, so they were pretty well taking care of it at first base, even though Hodges was in the twilight of his career. But Bilko, they acquired Bilko primarily because there was a referendum about Chavez Ravine, the land there where they were going to build Dodger Stadium. It was in danger of not passing, and the Dodgers acquired Bilko to help them at the gate and at the ballot box. They won the referendum by about 26,000 votes. Buzzy Bavasi, the general manager, later said they would not have won that referendum and the rights to build the ballpark, Dodger Stadium, where they did, without Steve Bilko. So Bilko, in fact, Bavasi said they should name a street there. They don't have one, but they should name a street there called Bilko Way because he paved the way for Dodger Stadium.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, that too, a very controversial and still resonates today in terms of that land and the displacement of the families that grew up there and all of that, right? So, but you can imagine how contentious a situation that story that was, but that you're also now hinting at what was to come, right? I mean, so do you think Bilko, and then I want to get to the other members of the team, and maybe this applies to this as well. Players in the two teams in Los Angeles, and perhaps even the Seals up in San Francisco, was there any inclination that this Pacific Coast League thing was going to be potentially usurped by a Bigfoot team or two, kind of invading their territory, so to speak, and maybe not a bad idea to perhaps stick around because perhaps they could hook up with said major league team when one appeared? Or am I just projecting?
Well, the best chance the Coast League had of becoming a third major league was right after World War II and in the late 40s and early 50s. They didn't take advantage of that. They some of the cities did not have ballparks that were considered major league. Probably the best ballpark in the league was Wrigley Field. Seal Stadium in San Francisco was the next, and not coincidentally, both cities got big league clubs when the Dodgers and Giants moved west. Of course, when the Dodgers came out in '58, everybody knew the American League was going to soon establish a team there, and they did in 1961. It was an expansion team. Guess who they drafted? Bilko. Guess where they played? Wrigley Field. Bilko hit 20 home runs, by the way, that year. And the last home run hit at Wrigley Field was by Steve Bilko. He hit it off of Mudcat Grant. So it's a kind of a romance story, Tim, if you want to know. I mean, for a baseball fan, Bilko was the darling of L.A. fans. He had these great years with the minor league Angels. He comes back with the Dodgers, and while he didn't stay with the Dodgers long, he is at least credited with helping them get Dodger Stadium where they wanted to build it. And then, of course, he returns with the Angels in '61. He played with the Angels both in '61 and '62. He finished his career back in Rochester, New York, where he had starred earlier on in his career. So Bilko, is just one of the, again, kind of this folk hero that was the biggest baseball star that we had in L.A. prior to the Dodgers, Koufax and Drysdale later on. But that was several years later.
All right, what's this? Lucy Nicotine. Yes. Well, hey, look, folks, we're all adults here, and some of us choose to use nicotine to relax, focus, or just unwind after a long day. And Lucy Nicotine is a company that was created to help nicotine users find a cleaner option and feel better about the ways they consume nicotine. Now, look, I'm not a smoker. I've not been a chewing tobacco kind of guy. We all know that nicotine is absolutely endemic to those activities. You look, if you're looking to evolve, say, from the smoking habit, but recognize that nicotine is part of the mix, well, perhaps Lucy Nicotine is a helpful way to evolve from those habits. Their latest product is called Slim Nicotine Pouches, which contain pure synthetic nicotine and provide the same satisfaction that nicotine users expect without any tobacco at all. Lucy Slim Pouches use the newest technology for synthesizing, he says, pure nicotine in the lab, none of the tobacco and all of the nicotine satisfaction. They come in 3 strengths, 4, 8, and 12 milligrams, and 3 exclusive and inviting flavors, spearmint, mango, and cool cider. So don't compromise when you're choosing your nicotine products. Go with the newest tobacco-free options from Lucy Nicotine. And my listeners can go to lucy.co and use the promo code GOODSEATS to get 20% off your order of Lucy Slim Pouches or any other of the Lucy nicotine products. That's lucy.co and use promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. Now, I got to use this disclaimer. Warning, this product contains non-tobacco nicotine, and nicotine is an addictive chemical. Thank you, Lucy Nicotine, for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Can you give me some sense of some of these other players that were on these Angels teams in the late 50s? Journeymen, perhaps? Players coming down, players going up? What constitute the rosters for me, and maybe a couple of names that stand out as being a sporting players for him?
Well, they were castoffs, and I like to say they went from castoffs to being champs. They all had a little bit of a chip on their shoulders, including Bilko. They all had something to prove. Dave Hillman, who I live in Kingsport, Tennessee. Dave also lives in Kingsport. Dave, by the way, turns 94 this month of September. He's the oldest living New York Met. Dave won 21 games for the Angels in '56. He went on to have a pretty decent career with the Cubs, but the Cubs were so bad, it's not necessarily reflected in his record. Gene Mauch was the second baseman. And to many of the players, he was like a second manager. Mauch, at the end of that season, was taken up by the Red Sox, and it was with the Red Sox organization that he got into managing, first in Minneapolis, and then, of course, he moved on to manage with the Phillies and a lot of other clubs in the majors. You had players like Bob Speak. Speak had been with the Cubs the previous year in 1955, and in the month of May, he had set a record, hitting 11 home runs in that lone month of May. There was players like Elvin Tappy, a catcher. He had been one of the rotating coaches with the Cubs in the 60s. They had Dick Drott, who was prior to, I'm trying to think of the Woods, the pitcher for the Cubs who came along. He held the strikeout record for a single game, Dick Drott, until Woods came along years later. Dick Drott, they thought he was going to be a great pitcher in the majors. He won 15 games as a rookie, but then he came up with arm trouble. Jim Bolger was an outfielder. He had a great year in '56. He bounced around with several other teams in the majors. None of these guys went on to become great stars in the majors, but several of them went on to become managers like Mauch, Elvin Tappy, Jim Fanning, who became a manager of the Montreal Expos and also a great scout. He was a catcher on that team. So they had a lot of talent. I probably have left out a few guys. George Freese, best known probably for his brother Gene Freese. He had been in the majors. Mock was at second. Bilko was at first. Gayle White, the center fielder, had been a starting center fielder for the Cubs 2 straight years, 55, 56. So they had a lot of talent. Their utility man was a guy named Piper Davis. Piper Davis was known, Willie Mays called him a second father. He actually taught Willie Mays how to hit. And he was Willie Mays' manager with the Birmingham Black Barons in 1948. Piper Davis led the league in pinch hitting in 1956, and he batted .316 overall. So they had some outstanding players. They had a pitcher named Red Adams who won well over 200 games in the minors, had a cup of coffee in the majors, but became a great pitching coach with the Dodgers. Under his tutelage, you had guys like Tommy John, Bob Welch, Don Sutton come out. Well, Red Adams always had a sore arm when he pitched. In one game against the Hollywood Stars, he shut him out. After the game, Bobby Bragan the manager of the Stars, went up to Red Adams and said, "Red, have you ever had worse stuff than you had today?" He said, "Yes, Bobby, but I didn't need it."
I have so many other spin-off questions I could throw at you around the team. But 56, though, right? What was it about that season that sort of clicked? I mean, they dominated. They won the league, the regular season by 16 games. 107 wins. I mean, was there anything in the water, in the air going on? I mean, the seasons around those, the season prior and after weren't all that bad, but they were certainly not nearly as dominant. Was there anything sort of special? Maybe it was Bilko specifically, but what was it about 56 that kind of just that clicked? And I got another question after that, which kind of maybe sets the tone for how we off ramp for this story.
Okay, I think it was a combination of things, Tim. But it was Bilko, of course, was the centerpiece. He was this guy on a pedestal having this phenomenal year that none of the other players could believe he was having. I mean, they knew he had ability, but it was like it was all coming together for him that year. And these other players were in awe of him. And I think Bilko lifted up the rest of the team. Gene Mock had his greatest year. Jim Bolger had his greatest year. Dave Hillman had his. I mean, all the guys in this team had career years that season, and that's why they won the pennant by 16 games. It just all clicked. Bilko remained in L.A. the next year. The Dodgers, by the way, had bought the rights to Wrigley Field. They were preparing to move out in 58. And so Bilko hit 56 home runs the following year in 57. But the Angels were not as dynamic a team. I think it was Mock's leadership, Bilko's tremendous power, and then all these other guys just kind of getting on this bandwagon, and they're having this great year. And I like to refer to them as the last great minor league team because soon after that, you had expansion come in. And while you did have here and there some good minor league teams come along in future years, in Pawtucket, they had a team with Jim Rice and Fred Lynn. In Spokane, they had teams with some of the future Dodger stars. But I think the number of players you had at that time, the league at that time, it was still a very strong league. And just how this team dominated that league, I think it makes it the last great minor league team.
So here's the question that maybe kind of can sort of get us into the cul-de-sac of this, because I could go on and on with all kinds of specific questions. But what was the feeling amongst the players, the management, the fans, the media around this time? I mean, obviously 56, a great season, great story in Bilko, a local celebrity at that, a crackling rivalry with the Stars around this period of time. But I'm just wondering how ominous or excited or some combination thereof was the feeling around this not lasting somehow, right? Maybe Major League Baseball truly coming to the West Coast and, as I said before, colonizing. How much did people know or think they knew? How many of the signals were obvious, and or did people sort of recognize that this was not going to end, I want to say well, but it was not going to go on as it was, idyllic as it might have been, or felt as it might have been, for too much longer.
They were looking over their shoulders at the major leagues, the Dodgers in particular. They knew that the Dodgers or some team from New York, because New York had 3 teams. You only had 16 major league teams at that time. 3 of them were in New York. In fact, for many years, up until Milwaukee moving west, or up until the Boston Braves moving west to Milwaukee, you had, of the 16 teams, 11 of them were in 5 cities. Boston, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, and Philadelphia. So it was not our national pastime in terms of the majors. If you wanted to call a national pastime, you had to include the minors and you had to include the West Coast. So the 56th season, while it was a great season, the writers were antsy. They wanted to cover Major League Baseball. The writers themselves in L.A., I don't think fully appreciated the accomplishments of either Bilko or the team. Because they had this minor league mentality and they were looking forward to a major league team coming out there. I think Bilko himself knew, as well as several of the players, that it wouldn't be long that the major leagues would be invading their territory. That's just why I think Bilko signed the contract he did for 56 and 57. That was money on the table he could have then, rather than count on the major leagues, and he might be riding the bench again in the majors. So, it was not fully appreciated, not until later. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write about the 56 Angels is I never felt that they were given their due. Even when people compiled lists of greatest minor league teams, the 56 Angels were left off of that list. Well, that's unfortunate because it was a great team, and it was a great team in what was an outstanding league. And I think, as Bilko proved when he went back to the majors, and played for the Angels at Wrigley Field in 61 and hit 20 home runs there, playing part-time, by the way. He didn't even have 300 at-bats that year. He was capable of what Tommy Lasorda was asked one time, and that was Lasorda was asked, how would Steve Bilko do in the majors today? And Lasorda said he would hit between 55 and 60 home runs every year.
Give me a sense of Bilko died in 78, right? Sadly, at only 49 years of age.
Right.
And your book came out in 2014, so I'm guessing you never got a chance to talk to him at all.
Oh, I did. No. I interviewed him. I did. I spent a weekend with him in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. Bilko was not one to talk much about himself. A lot of the material I got while I was with him, I asked him to take me around to his favorite pubs in Nanticoke. And he didn't really drink much while we were going around, but his friends would tell me about him. And, of course, they were in awe of Steve Bilko. But it was through his friends that I got to know quite a bit about him. And then subsequently, I've gotten to know the rest of his family. But when I wrote the book, I did not know the entire family. I relied mostly on interviews with his teammates. And his teammates, of course, nobody ever said a bad thing about Steve Bilko. They were all in awe of his home run ability. And I haven't covered this yet, but his beer drinking ability. He had a tremendous talent. Ted Bowlesfield, who was a pitcher with the 61 Angels, he said he could drink more beer in one sitting than anybody I've ever seen. Unlimited capacity for it. The thing that baffled me, he never went to the bathroom. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess the other question I was going to ask out of that was, did he ever feel that he didn't get maybe a longitudinally better shake, I guess, in terms of his major league career, looking in retrospect as a career, given the fact that he kind of just had his 3 arguably best years in the minors? Was there any sort of wistfulness around that, or was
yes, okay. Absolutely?
Because you're mentioning why he stayed in L.A., right? Financially, not a bad move, right? It's like you're the big fish in the smaller-ish pond, right? But I got to think as you look back on the career once it's done, he may feel like he got kind of short shrift for those 3 very successful but minor league years.
The one thing that he begrudged was Bob Sheffing, the manager in 1956, was rewarded for that great year by becoming manager of the Cubs in 1957. Sheffing claimed that he couldn't bring Bilko up. He said he wanted to, but he said he couldn't bring Bilko up because of the contract Bilko had. Well, that could have been waived. The Bilko always wanted to know what he could have done at Wrigley Field in Chicago. The two ballparks, Wrigley in Chicago and LA, are very similar. It probably hitting a home run in LA was a little easier. You didn't have the wind to deal with, and the power alleys were a little shorter. But distance wasn't a problem with Bilko. His shots were monstrous shots anyway. Bilko wanted to see what he could have done in Chicago because of what he did in LA. He was very confident that if given another shot at Chicago, when he played for the Cubs in '54, he didn't see much action. That's why the slogan "Bingo to Banks," "Bingo to Bongo" occurred, because he was on the bench most of the time. And of course, '55 he was in LA, '56 he was in LA, and '57 he was in LA. Sheffing was still managing in '58 when Bilko returned to the major leagues with the Reds. The Cubs could have easily had picked Bilko up at that time. Sheffing had promised, as well as the general manager, John Holland. John Holland was the general manager of the Angels in '56. Again, he was promoted to the majors along with Sheffing. Both of them had promised that they would give Bilko a shot if they got up to the majors. Neither did. And Bilko, if there was one grudge he held years later, it was against Sheffing and John Holland for not keeping their promise of bringing him up to the Cubs.
Well, but by all accounts, though, he's arguably one of the best for the period of time he was there. One of the best minor leaguers of that era, for sure, right? And he got posthumously inducted into the Pacific Coast League Hall of Fame. And look, I think maybe in some respects too, also kind of at least got a certain level of satisfaction in that he was able to essentially end his major league career with the namesake franchise that expanded into the major leagues in Los Angeles. Well,
first off, he was, prior to Koufax and Drysdale and some of the Dodgers that came along in the 60s with those championship teams, he was the most popular baseball player in LA prior to that. His popularity was unsurpassed with the Phil Silver show and Phil Silver's naming his character Sergeant Bilko, and years later there was the movie Sergeant Bilko with Steve Martin. I mean, Bilko's fame is such that, again, the great columnist Jim Murray referred to him as an authentic American sports hero. And I got a letter from a longtime Angels fan who he actually had sent the letter to Mrs. Bilko on Steve Bilko's death at age 49. And in the letter, he calls Steve Bilko the last American sports hero. And I think there's a case to be made for that because he was humble. He was truly a heroic figure to those of us who saw him play, particularly the kids who saw him play. And then, of course, you have this legacy that carried on with the television series and then the movie, Sergeant Bilko. And then, of course, what he did in terms of, although a lot of people don't know, what he did in terms of the Dodgers being able to build Dodger Stadium where they did. That wouldn't happen without Steve Bilko, and I think there's a lot of other things in regards to baseball in LA wouldn't have happened without Steve Bilko. And that's why, the team, the LA Angels in 1956, their nickname was the Bilko Athletic Club. So I think that was appropriate because it was Bilko wasn't the lone star in that team, but he was the greatest star in that team, and I think that was quite a tribute to him, to the league, and to minor league baseball.
All right, two last questions, I promise.
Sure, no problem.
One about Bilko and one more generally to round us out. So because of that fame and because of that TV series and the name, was there, I'm guessing he didn't get any kind of taste of any of that success that Silver's had with that show. He didn't get any royalties or any of that kind of stuff. It was just sort of name recognition, right?
Right, yeah. And the same thing, Joe Garagiola went on to become a famous sportscaster and was on Monday Night Baseball. Joe Garagiola told a bunch of Steve Bilko stories over the years. And And so his fame was spread not only by the television series, but by stories that other announcers or people like Joe Garagiola, who played with him in St. Louis, stories that they told about him. So it was, it was Bilko was a guy who his career didn't stop when he retired. People kept talking about Steve Bilko. And I found when my wife and I were out there in 2016 and his oldest son was throwing out the ceremonial first pitch, we were trying to find out where we were to park. We were going to be part of the Bilko entourage. And as we were going in the parking lot, we were going into the wrong section of the parking lot. The parking lot attendant, I happened to mention that I was author of the Bilko Athletic Club book, and I was there for Steve Bilko's son throwing out the first pitch. This man actually started to cry. He came out of the booth, the parking booth, started to tell me about how he saw Steve Bilko play when he was a younger man, and tears were in his eyes. So that's the kind of effect he had in 2016, about 5 years ago. And then I there's this song called "Who's on First" that the folk singer Ross Altman wrote. And he wrote, "Sometimes he hit like Kirk Gibson and others like Casey at the bat. When that bat connected tape measure homers just like the Babe, he put them in the stratosphere. What's on second? I don't know is on third, according to Abbott and Costello. But who's on first? That's easy. The LA Angels' Steve Bilko, Angelino Bambino, working class coal miner's son. He was our Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, and Ted Williams, all rolled into one."
All right, here's my last question. It's one that kind of encapsulates kind of some of the things that we like to sort of roll around and obsess about on this little show, and that's teams and the names and the where they're domiciled and their lineages and whatnot. Right? It's clear that the LA Angels, when they came as an expansion team in 62, right? It was 62?
61.
61, I'm sorry. 62 was the Mets. I get them mixed up. Obviously it was a baseball cap tip in the general direction of the minor league team that preceded them. And obviously they became the California Angels for the longest time as they went down the I-5 there to Anaheim. But now over the last number of years, right, there's been sort of this, pullback, if you will, to have it both ways with this Los Angeles Angels again, but not quite. And I don't know, there's something artificial to me about the current naming of the franchise in its desire to be the California Angels, yet be the Los Angeles Angels at the same time. And I know you don't live in Orange County or in Los Angeles, but how do you feel sort of the appropriation, if you will, of this name? And I don't know, it seems to be sort of an egregious sort of, money grab to kind of annex, I guess, Los Angeles after years of being sort of Orange County's team using that Angels name.
Well, of course, growing up in Los Angeles, I'm quite familiar with the area, and of course, I have gone back many times since. Orange County is not LA. It's different. It's a much more affluent area. It's one of the most affluent areas in the LA area. When the Angels were established, the first year they played in Wrigley Field. Then they moved into Dodger Stadium. They didn't call it Dodger Stadium. They called it Chavez Ravine. But they remained in LA. And those were the years of Bo Belinsky, Dean Chance. Bilko was still with them in 62 when they had an outstanding year. The Angels were initially rooted in L.A., and I think fans identified with them because of the history of the L.A. Angels minor league team. But when they moved to Orange County, it changed. Now, yes, they had some great players come through there. Gene Mauch managed over there. Nolan Ryan came through, Reggie Jackson. But I don't think that the real LA Angels fans, the traditional ones, never made the transition to the Angels when they moved to Orange County. It was a good ballpark, nothing wrong with the ballpark, but it's still not Los Angeles. So as far as I'm concerned, go ahead and call them California Angels. The real LA Angels, to me, were the teams that were playing in LA, in Wrigley Field and Chavez Ravine, the first several years.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, but you look at the history of this franchise and its name, right? The California Angels becoming the Anaheim Angels, then this 10-year monstrosity known as the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, and then just fully doing the deed and becoming the quote unquote Los Angeles Angels, and I guess sort of disregarding, if you will, the actual geography involved. But I guess so. I get it, right? I mean, it's big business, right? And you said it before early in our conversation. You know, when you grow up and you latch onto a team or a sport, you know, as in your youth, your impressionable youth, you're less cynical, right? But it's hard not to be cynical when you sort of see that sort of thing. And I think especially given your fandom of the original version of this team. And here's the last sort of wind up, right? Question. When what are they called now? The Los Angeles Angels, or perhaps when the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, maybe, which I could sort of say is at least more accurate. How do you feel about when they do a throwback, right? And calling back that original Angels franchise in the PCL? I could see where you sort of maybe get some warm and fuzzies from that, right? But also frankly, it's a bit of a charade because you're kind of, stepping around or on the memory of this original, pure, wonderful Pacific Coast League version of a team.
Well, I'm a traditionalist, Tim, and anytime MLB teams celebrate, recognize that tradition, I'm not going to criticize it. I think it was great that MLB played the Field of Dreams game there. I think it's great they're going to continue doing that, at least for a while. In fact, I'd like to see MLB play more games in venues that have great traditions, such as Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama, or Grayson Stadium in Savannah. Both ballparks have been around a long time. Or some minor league venues that, again, might reacquaint fans, younger fans, with the great tradition of baseball. So and I'll say this, when Steve Bilko was inducted into the Shrine of the Eternals in 2016, the Angels were very gracious about allowing the Bilko family into the ballpark, treating them like celebrities, putting together a nice little video recognizing Steve Bilko's career and his oldest son, Steve Bilko Jr., throwing out the first pitch, while the grandson, who Steve Bilko he had just been born, named Steve Bilko, was there to see it. So these generations of Bilkos got to enjoy this. And so I'm not going to be critical of the Angels or anything they do, so long as they're recognizing their roots, and their roots are at Wrigley Field in L.A. and Steve Bilko in 1961.
Well, there you go. We dig into that kind of lore. I'm fascinated and frustrated in combination thereof around teams and leagues and where their histories are domiciled, right? And I think it's important. This stuff is important. Without the doings of the original version, right, you arguably wouldn't have the name of the team and the confused history sometimes, or the appropriation, I guess, or misappropriation of that history. But, I guess at the end of the day, if it means having memories, to your point, like your Anaheim Stadium parking lot incident, that's probably not a bad thing. And the memory of not only the team, but also guys like Steve Bilko will continue. And I guess at the end of the day, that's not a bad thing.
No, and let me share this with you. I got a letter from Jack Hanna, a former ball player, never made it to the majors. He was the brother of Joe Hanna, who was on that 56 Angels team. Joe also didn't make it to the majors, but they formed a singing group, Sons of the San Joaquin, and I came to know Joe and Jack and their son Lon quite well. But at one point, Jack wrote me a letter, and he said this: "What would life be if it weren't for the remembrances? We have the future of which we know nothing. We have the present, which is so close and moving so swiftly by that we can't make much of it. But the past is as clear as our memories will allow. It is the memories of the past that convince me how important what I am doing is in the present." And that letter with that passage was came at a critical time when I was writing the book, and not because it was my first book, not quite sure I had the ability to finish what I had started years earlier. But I think it really captures what we're talking about, Tim, and that is our memories of the past are very important. And our memories of the ball players we first saw, the ballparks we first saw these players in, what they accomplished, what they meant to us at that time. These are all very important, particularly in this day and age where so much around us is swirling by and it's hard to understand. So I hope this book, The Bilko Athletic Club, I was initially inspired by The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn. And what I wanted to do with the Bilko Athletic Club was somewhat kin to The Boys of Summer. I wish I had written it or finished it sooner. Somebody said that to me once, Galen, this is a great book, but you should have written it 20 years earlier. Well, I wish I could have, but it would have been a different book, and there's a time for everything, and I like to think that when I finally did write this book, that the people who read it will appreciate it for what it was, and people who maybe weren't around at that time get a sense for what it was at that time.
All right, fascinating stuff, and you Los Angeles baseball fans, hopefully you enjoyed that as I did. Again, the book is a treat. It really is, and you can tell it's written with love, but not only love, but tremendous research and accuracy, and it's a fun read. It's again called The Bilko Athletic Club: The Story of the 1956 Los Angeles Angels. Galen White, our interviewee subject this week, is, of course, the author. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield. It is available, of course, wherever good books are found, and we highly suggest that you go through the link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 231 with Galen White, and you will find a convenient link to the book, as well as a whole bunch of other Galen White baseball publications. And you'll be giving us a couple of shekels of love for referring to Amazon, of course, probably the quickest place on the planet to ensure your hard copy, your soft cover copy, your Kindle version, whatever way you want to ingest this book, highly, highly recommended. You can follow Galen White on his website at GalenWhiteBaseball.com. Galen is spelled Gaylon. Galen White Baseball, all one word, .com. And you can also follow him on Twitter at Galen White, Gaylon White, White, at Galen White. While you're on social media, why don't you follow us, for God's sakes? How about that? Yeah, on Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And on Facebook, we'll find us on Good Seats Still Available, somewhere on that crazy platform known as Facebook. Our website, as I mentioned, again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. All of our episodes are available for you to search and find and share and stream and do whatever you want. If you don't already subscribe or follow our feeds on your podcasting catcher of choice, that's, of course, the most efficient way, because we'll put in, a couple of special episodes here and there, a passing of someone or a special episode commemorating something. So you don't want to miss out on that. But all of our original episodes, every one that we put out, will be found on the website. So for whatever reason, if you miss something, you'll know you'll have a backstop in that on the site. Of course, you can send us email. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And of course, you can also subscribe to our email weekly newsletter. Just search around on the website. I forget exactly where it is off the top of my head, but it's there somewhere. All you got to do is give us your name and your email address, and boom, you are on the list to know a little bit ahead of the hoi polloi of what's going to be on this coming week's episode. Who knows what next week is in store, but I look forward to bringing it to you. And once again, we want to thank and tip our Los Angeles Angels 1956 version of Pacific Coast League cap in the general direction of our great pal, Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. Thank you so much for putting our pieces together once again this week. And thank you, great listener, for listening as long as you have. And we welcome you to the proceedings, hopefully again next week. Until then, please stay safe And we'll see you soon, very soon. Bye-bye.